Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. How is everybody doing? Before I start, I should apologize for the discussion board issue this past week. This is the problem with remote learning, and more specifically, the problem with asynchronous remote learning. Unfortunately, the way it works is, I send things out, then 2, 3, 4 days later, you guys look at it. If there's any issues, you guys send me back the issue. I might not look at it for another 1, 2, or 3 days. So just the amount of time between the amount of communication is just a lot slower. So some of these issues sometimes happen. But I am going to reach out to IT and see why there are issues. I've used discussion boards in the past with no problem, so I'm not sure what's going on with this one. So for now, don't worry about that assignment. So I think for last week, it was a good general overview of, an introduction to training concepts. There was some interesting stuff, I think, with regards to regulating supplements. I hope you guys watched that 3-minute video. If you guys aren't familiar with the supplement industry, that 3-minute video can be pretty surprising, but it's the truth. That's the way things work, in that the supplement industry is largely unregulated. Unless something does harm to several people, then the FDA starts to investigate supplements and then pulls them. And it's really a process, kind of just like this process with the whole discussion board, right? Where one person might raise a flag. One person emailed me, sort of looked into it. I send out a response. With supplements, one person's going to make a complaint. Maybe they were in the hospital for whatever, but it's going to take several complaints. Then it takes up the process of the FDA actually investigating it. And then maybe at some point they make a decision to remove it from the shelves. And then obviously then the company has to come back and refine their product to make sure it's up to FDA standards. But it's a big process for sure. So let's move on and talk about today, defining and measuring energy. So we're a little bit more sports nutrition specific now. So a general overview. We're going to talk about energy and energy concepts. I think this first one is a little bit more theoretical in a sense. Then we're going to talk about measuring energy. We have to measure energy. If we're talking about sports nutrition, we need objective data. In order for us to actually get this objective data, we need to refine our measurement systems. So how do we measure energy? Right. And then finally, concepts of energy balance. I would say points 2 and 2.1 and 2.2 really support 2.3, which is really just practical application, right? How do we apply concepts of energy? How do we apply these measurements that we learn and these data points into real practice? That's really what 2.3 is about. So just some questions that you guys should kind of ask yourself right now. What is energy? Do we know what energy is just yet? I'm talking about you, the student. How do we measure energy? How do we measure energy? How do we measure energy expended? What do we need energy for? That's a good one. Do you need energy just sitting down right now? Do you need energy sleeping? I mean, the answer that you guys should say is yes. There's lots of things for us to need energy from sleeping. Just because we're sleeping doesn't mean we're not using energy. Our heart is still beating, right? Our body is still going through processes. Muscle protein synthesis or muscle protein turnover is still taking place while we are sleeping. This costs energy, right? How do we process this energy, right? How do we process energy? You could think about this in terms of exercise, which we talk about in a little bit. So energy and energy concepts, 2.1. First, we need a working definition. And as the text said, energy is a little hard to define because there's various forms of energy: thermal, mechanical, chemical. All right, but simply put, energy is the ability or capacity to do work. Work costs energy. So in order to do things, we need energy, right? In order to wake up in the morning, right? In order to go to class, in order to go to the gym and lift weights, all of this costs energy. I should have started with this, but the first law of thermodynamics, right? About energy. right? Energy is neither created nor destroyed, right? And I think we should learn this because constantly throughout this body, energy is being turned over in various forms, right? Whether it's for us as we're moving, a lot of this energy is getting dissipated as heat, okay? So it's not created or destroyed, it's transformed. And I could have said, dissipated as heat. I could have said transformed as heat. So an example of the first law of thermodynamics of energy is, we could start with some type of chemical work or chemical reactions in our body. In this case, which I talk about later on, is, the breakdown of ATP. Right? What really, that's chemical work. There's chemical processes in our body breaking down ATP to help produce energy. This eventually leads to mechanical work. Mechanical work is really force production. Okay? So the practical, so there's just the general examples. Here are the actual examples. So the hydrolysis or breakdown of ATP is chemical work. Mechanical work could be thought of as a contraction of your muscle, or simply put, just flexing a weight or moving a weight, something along those lines that causes a contraction. So bioenergetics. Bioenergetics sounds like a fancy word. Take a minute. What would you think of bioenergetics to mean? Write it down. Pause this slide, write it down. What is bioenergetics? Well, you got to break it down a little bit. Bio, or biology, right, is usually like the study of the living organism. And energetics is simply put as energy. Okay, so bio, the science of a living organism, energetics, energy. Put them together, you've got the study of the transformation of molecules in the body to produce energy, right? And when I say molecules, I'm typically talking about food. We break down food for energy, but it's not just food, and that's why molecules is really the better term, because ATP is really where we get our energy, and the transformation of things like sugars and starches into ATP eventually get used to produce energy. So this we talk about much later on, and you'll end up talking about this much more in depth in exercise physiology. I know several of you are currently taking exercise physiology with Dr. Mel, but the three dominant energy systems, right, are your phosphocreatine system, and in more practical application, this is the dominant energy system for anything that's 10 seconds or less, right? So this is for something that's like a 100-meter sprint. Your glycolytic system, right? This is for something that's above 10 seconds, usually in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 minutes. So any activity that's about 2 to 4 minutes of high intensity exercise. Once it gets less than 60 seconds, less than 30 seconds, really less than 30, it becomes very phosphocreatine dominant. In that middle range is the glycolytic system. And then finally, once we get above 2, 3, mostly once we get above 4 minutes, your oxidative system starts to take over. We will discuss this more later on because these, especially the glycolytic and oxidative systems, really are going to dictate what you're using for energy, right? With the oxidative system, right, in a marathon, when you're running a marathon, you're predominantly using fats, right? With your glycolytic system, we're predominantly using glucose for energy, okay? We don't really talk about that much in this chapter, so don't worry too much about that. It was just an introduction into those topics. So, the golden currency. This is what we need to know. And sometimes this class can be difficult in teaching because, now knowing that some of you guys aren't coming from an exercise science background, I have to really figure out, what background you're coming from. I have to figure out if you've taken exercise physiology or not, because some of you already have. So it can be difficult a little bit. And for some of you guys, this is just simply a rehashing of a lot of these things. But ATP, we need to know what ATP is, right? ATP is our golden currency in terms of energy. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. If you look at this picture, right, this is that molecule right at the top. We actually have two different variations of that picture, but I prefer the one on the right. It's a little bit simpler. I'm never going to ask you the chemical, or excuse me, the atomical components of things like ATP. That's not the nature of this class. This isn't a biochemistry class. So don't worry about nitrogen and oxygen and all those things. I'm never going to ask you the exact amounts of the atomic components of an atom. But ATP, we do need to know that it is composed of adenosine triphosphate. So you have your adenosine over here on the right. In the middle, you've got your ribose, and then specifically that's bound to 3 phosphate molecules, right? Triphosphate, right? These triphosphate molecules, right? There's 3 of them. There's bonds between them. These bonds are what we would call high energy bonds. In order for us to use some energy from ATP, we need to break one of the bonds from ATP, and in the process of doing this, we need an enzyme called ATPase, right? So ATPase, this is an enzyme which will help increase the rate at which we hydrolyze ATP. Remember, with regards to enzymes, they don't change the product, right? They don't change the end reactants, right? The reactants are the products. The only thing that enzymes do is that they speed up the process of the chemical reaction. So essentially what we have is we have ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It goes through hydrolysis. We can increase this process of hydrolysis. And then our end products leave us with what we would call adenosine diphosphate, so 2 phosphate molecules. We have an inorganic phosphate plus energy, right? So when we go through that hydrolysis of ATP, it leaves us with energy which we can use for various things in the body, right, which I'll show you next. Oh, sorry, we talked about enzymes first. So enzymes, right? It's a protein used to speed up or catalyze a chemical reaction in the body. You can use catalyze or speed up almost interchangeably. I also wanted to just kind of discuss A's. When you're trying to understand things or you're reading peer-reviewed literature, textbooks, whatever it is, it's helpful to just learn the endings of words so you can kind of understand what it's meant. Anytime something ends with A's, it's usually breaking something down, right? So ATPase, right, breaks down ATP. Hormone-sensitive lipase, right? Lipase, right, is going to be the breakdown of fat, or specifically triglycerides, which we'll get to later on. Amylase is the breakdown of sugar. Okay? So anytime it has A's at the end of it, just know that something is being broken down by that enzyme. Okay? In the text, they talk about 2 factors that affect enzyme activity, and I think this is important for us. One being temperature and one being pH. So body temperature, right? One of the reasons we warm up is to increase our core body temperature. By increasing our core body temperature, we can actually increase our enzyme activity. If we increase our enzyme activity, what does it do? It can speed up the chemical reactions within the body. So in the case of ATP, right, let's say we're going out for a game of soccer, basketball, some high intensity sport, right? We want to warm up before this sport so we can increase our enzyme activity so we can help replenish ATP much faster, right? So if there's an upregulation of ATPase because our core temperature has been increased through a warm up, we may be able to produce more force, which in turn might make us run faster, jump farther, whatever it is. So that's just a reason in and of itself to make sure you're getting in a warm-up before a sport. Increased enzyme activity, or the upregulation of enzymes. pH also important. So you could think of it in a few ways, right? There's certain foods that will help raise your blood pH or lower it, right? So we want to make sure certain foods right, are going to put our pH in an appropriate area because we don't want to be too acidic or too alkalinic either. Okay. Another way to think of this is as we start to exercise, our body's going to produce certain substances. In many cases, we're talking hydrogen ions, right, which is going to make our body much more acidic. Because of this raise in acidity, this is one of the theories of fatigue, right? Because our blood pH is being risen, right, and we're becoming more acidic, it creates a less than optimal environment for our muscles to contract, and essentially muscles start contracting much slower and produce more force, and we slow down, okay? And that's really because enzyme activity is decreased. So, sliding filament theory. So as I was preparing these slides and thinking about the text, this is one of those ones where it's like, okay, for a student, you know, that's coming from a psychology background, a business background, taking this class, this is where some of you guys may have never seen this in your life. If you've taken anatomy and physiology, you've probably seen this. Obviously, if you've taken exercise physiology, you definitely have seen this. But we need to have a working understanding of how our muscles contract, right? And the sliding filament theory really explains that. I can't go too in depth for this class, but we have to understand that we've got these fibers within our muscles called myofibrillar proteins. Your myofibrillar proteins are actin and myosin, right? And they're really stacked on top of each other like this. Let's just say this is my thick, the thick one, right, is myosin. Right? Let's just say this is myosin, this is actin. They're stacked on top of each other, right, with a certain amount of overlapping. Some overlap more than others, some overlap less than others. Okay, and that's what this is trying to depict. Essentially what happens, right, is in order for us to produce a contraction, right, there's ATP at the myosin head, right? They have these what we call a globular heads. Once acetylcholine is released, again, I'm getting a little in depth here for exercise physiology, acetylcholine is released, and then eventually calcium ions are released from your sarcoplasmic reticulum. The calcium ions bind with troponin, right, which is, it's tough to see, it's kind of up here, right, and it moves, right, because the troponin or tropomyosin are blocking our binding sites. So these things can't move until tropomyosin moves out of the way, right? Once the calcium, it binds to troponin, and once the tropomyosin moves out of the way on your actin, then, right, then your myosin can, the globular heads can bind to the binding sites, right? They bind here, which is seen in figure 2 now. Now they start to bind, and then it starts to go through what we call the power stroke, right? Once they're bound, right, the power stroke happens, the ATP is being used, right? And it's actually moving the muscles. So if they're overlapped this way, we go through a power stroke, it moves them this way, right? That is a muscular contraction, right, in the simplest sense. And in order for this to take place, right, ATP is being used for the power stroke, both which your text noted for contraction and relaxation. So we need ATP for both contraction and relaxation. Sorry if that was a quick, rough sketch of sliding filament theory. Honestly, most professors would probably teach that in a solid 30-40 minutes. So for those of you that have never heard of it, you can definitely find some YouTube videos if you want to increase your understanding of sliding filament theory. It's not really necessary other than a basic understanding for this class. All right, measuring energy. So like I said, we need to learn how we can measure energy and get some objective data on what we're burning, okay? Or even the energy contents of food. How do we know how much calories are in a food? What is a calorie? So we're going to start with. So I brought back the definition: energy, the ability to perform work, right? In the system of units, we can measure energy a few ways. There's several different ways to measure energy. You could measure it as a joule, right? 1 joule is the work required, right, to move something, the force, right? 1 Newton for 1 meter, right? So 1 joule can be used interchangeably with 1 Newton meter. You can also use 1 calorie, right? 1 calorie equals 4.184 joules. So we're kind of getting bogged down in some terms here. What's a little bit more relevant for sports nutrition? Okay. Lowercase calorie, right? The lowercase calorie is the thermal energy required to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. All right, why do we need to know this? You'll find out in a second. But this is where these are the relevant things, because what do we use in everyday language, right? We use the term calorie. Unfortunately, we use the term calorie slightly off the true definition, in that what we use as a calorie is really a kilocalorie, right? Is really a kilocalorie. Again, don't worry too much about it, but anytime I say calorie in this text, I'm really using kilocalorie. So calorie with a capital C, right, and kilocalorie can be used interchangeably. A lowercase c really represents the thermal energy required to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. Okay. So how do we measure this energy? What are the calories in food? Well, this picture here on the bottom left, right, is what we would call a BOM calorimeter, right, or calorimetry. It's a form of direct calorimetry. Okay, so what essentially you have, if you look at the picture, if you ever want to YouTube a video, you could YouTube a video. You've got this cool looking chamber, right? Within the chamber, right, you've got a piece of food for a BOM calorimeter. That's a picture on the left, right? The food is encapsulated by some like metal. Directly around this metal encapsulation sphere, whatever it is water. Okay, so what they start to do is they start to heat up food, and they start to burn the food. As the food is burned, right, and this is directly to the food, the energy releases heat, and that heats up the water outside the tube, outside the metal, right? Based on how much the water heats up, that's how we determine the energy it takes to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. So that's why that definition is important. Right? So that's for food, right? So a BOM calorimeter is for food, right? You can use direct calorimetry. Now I'm forgetting how to say it, right? And that's the picture in the middle here. Okay, so very similar, very similar concept, where a person is within a sphere, right? A container of sorts, a room, right? An insulated room. They could either be sitting there, or they could be running on a treadmill, just like this picture depicts. And there's water running through these metal pipes at the top, right? As the athlete exercises, right, his body gives off energy in the form of heat, right? As he gives off heat, the water in those pipes are going to heat up. When we can measure the change in temperature, we can actually measure the energy that person is using on the treadmill or sitting or whatever he is, right? So that's a form of direct calorimetry. Okay. Now, this picture on the right is what we have next. So the problem with calorimetry, or direct calorimetry, right, is that it's very expensive, incredibly expensive. In fact, I've never seen any one of these personally myself, right? What I've seen on the right here is a metabolic cart, and what many of you have seen, and if you're in exercise physiology, you've seen me use, obviously a few weeks ago, is a metabolic cart, right? A metabolic cart is used for indirect calorimetry. Okay, so what we found, right, what some really smart scientists have found, is that as we use energy, as energy use increases, there's a proportional increase in the amount of oxygen consumption and CO2 production, right? Once we know that there's this proportional increase, right, we can actually determine the energy expenditure by measuring this gas exchange. Like I said, O2 consumption and CO2 production, right? And this is essentially your working definition of indirect calorimetry, is determination of energy expenditure by measuring gas exchange. So by using this, right, we put a mask on a person, okay? They breathe into it. We can measure the amount of oxygen and the exact amount of CO2 expired. By doing this, and by using a formula, we can calculate a few very cool variables. One is, well, very simple. We can measure your O2 consumed, right, in terms of liters consumed. How much oxygen is somebody breathing per minute? We can also calculate somebody's VO2 max, right? What you should know is VO2 max is essentially the gold standard for aerobic fitness, right? The higher somebody's VO2 max, the more aerobically fit they probably are. And that's usually expressed in terms of milliliters per kilogram per minute. We could take this a step further and we could start to determine resting metabolic rate. So that's that ratio, that proportional ratio of CO2 and O2 that's being both inhaled and exhaled to help determine your resting metabolic rate. I'm probably going to send you guys a video, right, to help understand resting metabolic rate a little bit more. And then, oh, well, we need a definition again. Again, I'm sorry, some of you guys haven't taken these classes before, but what's a working definition of resting metabolic rate? It's essentially the amount of energy it costs you to exist, right? So if you're just sitting there at your computer screen, just watching this 20, 30 minutes, whatever it is, it's the amount of energy it costs to just sit there, go through whatever processes to hold your body up, but essentially you're in a non-active state. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Another very cool feature of the metabolic cart is that it can actually measure what we're utilizing for energy in terms of macronutrients, right? So it could determine how much carbohydrate or how much fat we're using for energy. And this is essentially what my master's thesis was, where I had somebody on the metabolic cart and I wanted to see if they became more fat adapted, where I wanted to see if they were going to burn more fat for energy or more carbohydrates for energy. So this has been researched a decent bit, and this is the whole theory behind fasted cardio, where if you do fasted cardio, right, and you have no carbohydrates in or no glucose in your bloodstream, right, what are you going to utilize for energy? Well, you're probably going to have to use your fat stores in your body for energy through lipolysis. Concepts of energy balance. All right. So this is where now you guys should understand a practical understanding. How do we apply all of these concepts of energy? Well, we have to understand the concept of energy in versus energy out, which can be used interchangeably with calories in versus calories out, right? Some people use this shorthand abbreviation. I don't know what you would call that, SICO, PICO, I don't know. But calories in versus calories out, energy in versus energy out. That is essentially what we're talking about is what you eat versus what you expend for energy. And at the end of the day, for weight loss or for weight gain, nothing else matters. Let me repeat that. For weight loss, at the end of the day, the bottom line is energy in versus energy out. People might tell you other things. They might tell you nutrient timing. They might tell you the glucose model of obesity, or excuse me, the insulin model of obesity. They might tell you also all sorts of things. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters is energy in versus energy out. And we'll talk about this a little bit on the next few slides. Just some interesting components, all right, or aspects of energy in. Energy in is what you eat, okay, or drink in terms of calories, right? So if we're talking about people that are typically trying to lose weight, and unfortunately, most of us should be trying to lose weight since over 70% of this country is either overweight or obese. We're mostly trying to lose weight. when people are trying to lose weight, they usually track their calories, right? Their macronutrient content, because that's the energy. When they're tracking their calories or journaling, right, we found that 1/3 of people actually underreport their calories. And to be honest, this is what the textbook says. I think it's much higher than this. You know, in all practical application, having worked with people, right, I think it's much higher than 1/3 of people underreporting. In a very interesting study in 1992, right, this is not from your text, Lichman et al. Found that they followed overweight or obese participants. I think the average BMI, or excuse me, the minimum BMI was 27 or above. Right? You guys should know that 30 and above is obese. A subgroup of the 224 participants were assigned to a weight loss protocol of 1,200 calories per day. So that's what they were supposed to eat, and they wrote it in their journals, and they thought they were eating 1,200 calories a day. However, a nutritionist was also, a registered dietitian was also following them around, watching what they eat in terms of portion sizes. Based on the nutritionist or the registered dietitian, it was determined that they were actually ingesting about 2,500 calories a day. So, those of you that know anything about weight loss, prior to this class, what does it typically take to lose a pound? About 500 calories per week. 500 calories per day, or 3,500 calories per week, right? So these people who thought they were eating 1,200 were actually eating 2,500. Instead of actually losing a pound a day, they're probably losing a pound a week. They're probably gaining a pound per week, which is just mind-blowing. Like, these people actually thought they were eating 1,200 calories a day, but in reality, it was more than 2,500. And from my experience in my world, I would say this is easily the number one reason why people struggle with weight loss. They're simply underreporting. They don't understand portion sizes whatsoever. We've become so accustomed to eating a certain amount of food that you don't really know what 1,300 calories is. All right, last few slides here. So some of these slides are actually taken not from this text. So I've taken them from another text. So if it seems a little off or some of the numbers seem off, that's why, right? But they're all pretty close. So your resting metabolic rate, I already gave you a working definition. It's the energy required for the maintenance of normal body functions under resting conditions, right? So my heart's still got to beat while I'm resting, right? That costs energy, right? Of this energy, right, 60 to 75% of the total daily energy expenditure of your resting metabolic rate, right? So I wrote 70% up top is really kind of the average, but it's somewhere between 60 and 75 depending on the person. So not to confuse you with too many percentages. What makes up your resting metabolic rate? Okay, well, the maintenance of your organs, right, actually costs 75%, right? Just maintenance of your organs. Muscle tissue, right? The maintenance of muscle tissue is 20%, which is fairly large. So what does that mean? People that are more muscular are going to have a higher energy cost to maintain their existence. They can eat more calories just to stay the same weight. And fat and adipose tissue costs about 5%. So for metabolic rate, 75% is organs, 20% is muscle tissue, and about 5% is fat or adipose tissue. We sometimes use the terms BMR and RMR, right, interchangeably. The only real difference is that to get a true basal metabolic rate, you would essentially have to wake up out of bed and start taking your metabolic rate right then, right? Resting metabolic rate, for instance, like if I take it at Mercy, usually I'm going to wake up, going to brush my teeth, might pull the garbage out, I'm going to walk to my truck, I'm going to drive over there, maybe I'll climb a flight of stairs. So it's not a true basal metabolic rate. That's what we call it, resting metabolic rate. So resting metabolic rate is always slightly higher than basal metabolic rate. So what factors influence your resting metabolic rate? There's a list of everything on page 52. I already said one of them, fat-free mass. So your muscle, right? The more muscular you are, right, the higher your resting metabolic rate is, which is a good thing. You can eat more food, right? So a perfect example, right? is if we look at two people that are 200 pounds, right? We've got person A, person B. Person A is 200 pounds, but he's 10% body fat. So he's 90% fat-free mass. Person B, 200 pounds, but he's 35% body fat, and he's 65% fat-free mass. Right? So one's carrying a lot more fat, one's carrying a lot more muscle, probably. Right? Person A, who's carrying a lot more muscle, his resting metabolic rate might be something like, I don't know, 2,000 calories, 2,100 calories, 2,200 calories, right? While person B, their resting metabolic rate might only be 1,500 calories. You know, I'm loosely using these numbers here, but you can see that if somebody is just much more muscular, they can ingest more to maintain their current existence because it costs more to maintain their muscle, right? Muscle is much more what we would call active than something like fat. And then another major contributor to a decline in resting metabolic rate is simply age, right? After 30, our resting metabolic rate declines about 2 to 3%. After 30, by the time you get to 60, you start to see noticeable differences in what you can eat. Otherwise, you're going to just start to put on food, right? After you, how do I word this? Your maintenance caloric intake just decreases a significant amount. Another thing is your thyroid. Your thyroid function is definitely, you've heard people being hypo or hyperactive thyroid, and it is a thing. I do think when I say this, people will often use this as an excuse for weight loss, when again, the amount of people that really have an underactive thyroid is way less than you think, much less than you think. That whole underreporting aspect of weight loss or weight gain is definitely the number one contributor, the number one reason people struggle with weight loss. Oh, gender. Sorry. So what makes up our energy expenditure during the day, throughout the day? So we've already said 70% is composed of our resting metabolic rate, which is what it takes to just maintain our existence. Okay, well, 10% is diet-induced thermogenesis. So this is one of those things where the terms differ from textbook to textbook. We can use diet-induced thermogenesis and thermic effect of food interchangeably. But essentially what happens is after we eat food, right, and ingest this, it costs energy. It costs mechanical energy for us to chew on the food. It costs chemical energy for some of the enzymes in our stomach to digest the food, and then to metabolize the food, right? So it costs about 10%. This is a fairly stable process from person to person. A big controversy over this is that should you eat 5 or 6 small meals or 2 or 3 larger meals? I can tell you, we used to say 5 or 6 small meals. Nowadays, the research doesn't really support that. I think 2 to 3 meals, based on the research, is just as fine for 5 to 6 meals, and it's not going to raise your it's not going to raise your metabolism as much as the average person thinks. So don't obsess. Oh, every 2 hours, I got to get food to raise my metabolism. I got to get food. That's not really the truth. Okay. The next one is the thermic effect of exercise and your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So these are both highly variable. All right, let me talk about NEAT first. So non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT, is highly variable. This is just kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis, and it's going to really be dependent on your career almost, or kind of what you do for the majority of the day. So if somebody is a laborer, you know, they work in construction, they move things around, maybe you own a moving business, something like that. Maybe you're a server at a restaurant. Your NEAT is going to be much higher than somebody who has an office desk job. They just simply don't move as much per day, right? So if somebody's NEAT is much higher, they can ingest more calories, or they need to ingest more calories. Now, the thermic effect of exercise is highly variable, again, because it depends on people's exercise habits. The vast majority of Americans are not really exercising on a regular basis, so the thermic effect of exercise is going to be negligible towards their total daily energy expenditure, right? But if you take somebody like, you know, one of my kids which that are a distance runner, and they run 30 miles a week, they run 5 miles a day, right? Their thermic effect of exercise is going to make up a much larger portion of their total daily energy expenditure. So all of these things, I've used the term TD already, all of these things combined are going to total up your total daily energy expenditure, and that's the total energy or calories expended within a 24-hour period, right? So you combine your resting metabolic rate, you combine the diet-induced thermogenesis, your NEAT, and your thermic effect of food, or excuse me, your thermic effect of exercise. That makes up your total daily energy expenditure. And that number is the one that matters most for practical application. Okay? So if you wanted to maintain your current weight, right, based on all of those numbers combined, you would eat the calories, your calories in, your energy in, would equate to, right, your TD. So I would ingest, if my total daily energy expenditure was 3,000 calories, to maintain my weight, I'd have to eat about 3,000 calories. Anything under that is what we would call a caloric deficit, right? So when energy expenditure exceeds energy intake, right? A caloric surplus is when energy intake exceeds energy expenditure, right? So a caloric deficit is what you would need. You absolutely must be in a caloric deficit to lose weight. Conversely, you absolutely must be in a caloric surplus to gain weight. So when people tell me, if we're talking practical application, right, when people come to me and say, I was only eating 1,000 calories last week, my log shows it, so on and so forth, based on, certain calculations that I would have done with them, I might tell them, like, well, it's probably impossible for you to not lose weight at 1,000 calories a day. It has to be impossible because your resting metabolic rate isn't that low, right? So what they're probably doing is they're probably not reporting correctly. Again, there's lots of factors that go into this. Their total daily energy, their total daily activity, how many steps they're getting per day, which is their NEAT, it's a part of their NEAT, their age, all of these things all play into it. But by and large, right, reporting needs to be done accurately in order to gain or lose weight according to someone's goals. That's it for today. Hopefully this wasn't too long for you guys.